Yes, I would like to welcome everybody to our meeting tonight for our ATD chapter and why your company needs a modern measurement strategy and how to create one. We have Stephen Just and Jim Delaney presenting, and I'll just turn everything over to them. And welcome.
Great, thanks. I think we'll start off just by introducing ourselves real briefly and then go into the presentation. I'm Stephen Just. And I have been working in the area of measurement and analytics for a long time. I worked at Bell Labs doing research after graduate school. Then I started a company which people in the pharmaceutical industry are familiar with, which was called Pedagog, which was an assessment management system company. About 10 years ago, I sold that company to an LMS company in Silicon Valley. And since then, I've been really doing two things. One of which is I'm the CLO of a micro-learning company, IntelliLearning, and I've also been consulting on learning and measurement strategy. And for the past year or so, Jim and I have been working together through an entity we created called Modern Measurement Excellence, helping companies develop measurement strategies around their L&D function. And that's really what we're going to be talking about today. Go ahead, Jim.
Thanks, Stephen, and good evening, everyone. Thanks for taking some time tonight. Jim Delaney, my consulting firm is Learning Experience Group, and as Stephen alluded to, he and I have had a relationship over the years in various travels in learning and measurement, and it's been exciting to get to work with him again now for probably over a year at this point. I come from a career path of learning and development, probably about half of that on the consulting side, so working with vendors and consultancies and developing training solutions in a variety of industries, but I also spent half of that inside enterprise learning functions. Most recently, the last few years before I jumped back out to consultancy, with a financial services firm, I worked or I had responsibility to 3 different centralized learning cost centers, about 50 employees, including offshore and nearshore resources. And when it comes to measurement and data, I've spent a lot of time not only looking at learner knowledge and behavioral trends, but certainly operationally how data can help drive the business of learning. And I think we're going to spend a lot of time on all those areas today. So very excited to have you all, and looking forward to diving in. So I'll go ahead and kick us off. But want to kind of start with what our objectives are for today. So today we'll learn how to communicate the purpose and benefit employing a measurement strategy, and kind of answering the question, why? Why do we need one? To kind of get started. We're going to identify common challenges and barriers that L&D teams face with implementing a consistent and effective measurement set of activities. And from Stephen and I's travels, especially recently, there's definitely some trends or themes that we're seeing across different industries, and we're going to ask for some of your feedback on kind of where you lie there. Thirdly, ask the important questions needed to tell your story. I think that's one of the biggest things where Stephen and I are focusing on with our clients right now is, what is the story of L&D? And I think what is the positioning of the business value of learning that is now more and more being asked, and there's more and more data now to use around that. So we'll spend some time there. Talk about applying modern research and practical techniques to create meaningful insights. There's definitely emerging research that is part of the consideration with measurement as it relates to learning. And we have to think about how learning has evolved even in the last few years and how measurement plays a role in that. Also want to implement a sustainable, scalable measurement framework that provides value to the organization. I mean, what we're basically saying here is you need a plan, but you need something that's pragmatic and simple enough to apply. And we think we have some core principles and a framework that you can apply immediately, whether you're a small organization or a cross-functional matrix learning team. There's all different ways you can apply that approach. And then finally, synthesizing and analyzing data from your current learning infrastructure, right? I think it goes without saying there's plenty of data available in most learning organizations. It's a matter of how to find it, how to take inventory, and how to use it properly. And we're going to spend some time on that as well. So with that, I think we're going to Stephen's going to kick us off a little bit of a polling question.
One slide before the polling.
One slide. I'm a little ahead of myself.
That's okay, no problem. So the first question is, why do you need a measurement strategy? And this should be obvious, and if we're obvious, more companies would have one probably. But we think it should be obvious. First and foremost, L&D is a business function, and every business function within a corporation measures what they do. Sales measures sales. They measure the cost of sales. Manufacturing measures how many products they produce, what it costs them to produce those products. Marketing measures their advertising budgets, and other ways of getting their message out, and the return on investment they get from those from those strategies. So L&D needs to approach its business in the same way. And what's really important is, as you'll see, data that you collect and display and analyze falls into a series of different areas. There's the operational side. What are you doing? What is your business? What is the L&D business doing day to day? There's the training effectiveness side. Are your learners learning? How do you know they're learning? How do you measure that they're learning? And then really importantly, and Jim alluded to this a minute ago, is you need to tell your story. How do you tell the story of L&D? We all know, those of us who have worked in L&D, either as consultants or within companies, it's not always highly valued. It's not always a highly valued function within a large corporation. It's seen as a cost center, not a profit center. And so you need the data in order to tell your story to the corporation at large. And having a measurement strategy helps you do that. So let's go on. We have a series of polling questions. The first polling question is, how would you characterize your current measurement strategy? And Jeff, if you could bring up that question. Now, one thing I do want to say about our polling questions, we're assuming you're part of an organization. We're well aware of the fact that many people on this call are independent consultants. So think about clients that you've worked with and try to answer from that perspective, as if you were part of their corporation. Okay. So, looking at the results here, this is very common. I think most L&D functions do some level of surveying or testing, but it doesn't roll up into a strategy. It's very tactical. It's not strategic in any way. And it's interesting that 0% of the people on the call said they do not have a solid strategy in place. And of course, that's our business, really, helping companies put one in place. But it's very typical of what we find. Almost never do we come across a company, no matter how large, no matter how sophisticated, that has a well deployed strategy in place.
So with that said, I think to kind of pin off of Stephen's point, there's a lot of reasons why we see organizations struggle or simply don't enact a proactive measurement plan. And again, these are in no particular order, but number one, outdated research, kind of hit on this earlier. There's a tremendous amount of academic research that Stephen can probably articulate much better than I can around principles for measurement as it relates to learning. Some things in terms of dispelling myths of traditional approaches we take today. But then when you think about the way learning has evolved the last few years, we've moved from a very course-centric approach to more learning experiences and journeys where there's a continuous learning model that isn't just formalized training. It's got other elements, experiential, et cetera. How we really adapted the measurement activities to model and parallel that learning approach. In some cases we have, in some cases we have not. So certainly looking at the latest research can bring new insights into how to apply that. Second area is lack of team knowledge and skills. And I think what we found, and I've experienced this myself when I was internal, having the right acumen as part of your learning and development skill set. And it's not just necessarily the ability to design, say, a good survey or a valid exam. It's also about understanding what the data is telling you and synthesizing it and making decisions with it. That to me is one of the bigger gaps we're finding, and there's an opportunity to upskill teams, learning teams, on how to use that data for productive reasons, right? Third, stakeholder expectation gap. As someone who's been part of a leadership team reporting into HR, a lot of learning groups also report into business functions. There's often a gap that I've seen and we've seen in our travels around how learning impacts the business. And I think for each and every stakeholder, it can be a very different thing they're looking for. But a big part of that is having the right handshake with your business stakeholders on formulating data that does tell that story, as we're kind of talking about here. But that gap is tremendous in terms of what data sets are going to help you drive your L&D business forward. And then finally, learning data overload. Beyond the LMS, we're definitely at a point where even smaller organizations are rolling out micro-learning systems, gamification, other platforms that we'll talk about a little later in terms of the larger ecosystem that present data in many different ways. The challenge there, of course, is it all lives in a different system and is generally interfaced through reports or dashboards separate from some unified approach. So how do you make sense of all that? How do you put it together to again, tell your story?
Yeah, I mean, I think,
go ahead, Steve.
If I can just emphasize that last point, in talking to clients over the past year or so, both Jim and I think have been surprised, maybe not surprised because we should have known this. There's rarely lack of data. People have lots of data. All the various systems that people use for learning spew out tons of data. The question is, what you do with that data? How do you analyze that data? How do you make sense of that data? And how do you create an analytics approach so that data is useful to you and the organization as a whole?
Yeah, great point, Stephen. So the bottom line here is there's a lot of barriers or challenges, and ultimately what tends to happen, what we tend to see is learning organizations become a little reactive to how measurement fits and plays a role in the larger learning strategy, for sure. So that cues up our next poll related to this. We'd love to hear kind of what do you feel is your biggest challenge or challenges when it comes to measurement? And this is, I think, multi-answer. So feel free to submit and we'll take a look at the results. And if you feel like there's something else, you can certainly add that in the chat room. We can take a look at that.
Yeah, if people have questions, certainly put them into the chat. Or really, it's a relatively small group. You can just unmute yourself and ask the question. We have no problem with that.
Hey, Stephen, it's Vicki. How are you?
I'm fine, Vicki. How are you?
I'm well, thanks. I'm looking at this and I'm thinking that it's something different than what's on here. I think that one of the biggest challenges at ASI is the fact that everybody is moving so fast in so many different directions that there really isn't a cohesive approach.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Vicki. And it's people have day-to-day functions, right? And their function is not to do analytics. So our consulting practice, we get brought in as outsiders. Obviously, we don't have day-to-day responsibility within the company. And a large part of our consulting practice is helping companies pull together all these data sources into, as you'll see later on, a dashboard so that you can quickly reference what you need in order to run the business of L&D and tell your story and make your case to the larger corporation.
Yeah, I think to add to that, Vicki, it's a great point. The competing priorities element is something we see, and one of our case studies, when we get to it, talks a little bit about that inconsistency of approach and how we kind of tackle that.
Mhm. So John, you have your hand up. I'm sorry.
Yes, thank you. I related to what Vicky said, I think there's most learning professionals are sort of the consummate doers. So their comfort zone is in design, deliver, and implement, or design, develop, and implement.
Yeah.
And they don't take the time to analyze and evaluate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's often an afterthought, right? They need to deliver, so they deliver. And before they can analyze and evaluate, they're on to the next project that they have to deliver on.
Yeah.
So it's a good point, John. Thank you.
Yep, great point. Jeff, maybe we can pull up the results. Jeff, can you post the poll results, please?
There we go.
There we go.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that 80% said lack of team knowledge and skills. You know, one of the things we know, and you know, John and Vicky, who just made those points, know this too. Certainly in the life sciences, which you know we all come out of, a lot of people who work in the L&D function, it's just a transitory position. They're coming out of a sales role, they're working in L&D for a while, and then they're going back out into maybe a management role in sales or elsewhere in the corporation. They're smart people, they're accomplished people, they're really good people, but they don't have any formal background in measurement and analytics. And you can't expect them to. It was never their job to have that background. So there's a real knowledge and skills gap, no doubt about it.
To add to that point, Stephen, too, from my experience, the even the formal training L&D paths, whether academic or professional development, tend to focus on the more general and structural design approach, and measurement is part of that. Evaluation theory is part of that, but it's just a small piece of a larger focus, right? So again, most of what I see are people that are generalists versus specialized in that particular area.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So it makes sense.
Yeah, good.
Good feedback.
Let's go on to the next slide. Good. So when we approach a project with clients, we ask 3 questions. Why do you want to measure? What should you measure? And what data or which data do you need to do that measurement? So it's a what, why, what, and which paradigm. And that's what we're going to take you through now, is that process of creating a measurement strategy to answer these 3 questions.
So the why measure, and we sort of kicked off, well, we did kick off the need for a measurement strategy up front, but the why really has to do with recognizing that there are multiple layers of opportunity for measuring and using data as part of the learning business. And what Stephen and I have sort of formulated is these 3 main pillars to establish what we see as a complete measurement strategy that can further justify and demonstrate value to the organization. From our experience, you know, many organizations implement pieces of these areas, but not necessarily in a formal or unified, meaningful fashion. So we'll kind of explain what we mean by each, and we can get a little more into the details of how it falls into the organizational process. So operational efficiency, and I like to call this sort of the business of running learning, the learning function. The idea that establishing operational metrics that help really track the scope and the health of your learning function or team, right? Because you're going to be navigating peaks and valleys of resources and projects and solutions and needs through time. And having those sort of fundamental metrics can help you make pragmatic decisions about running the business. And that's everything from project intake to the different modalities of training your team develops, resource allocation, it always surprised me a little that there's some key data points that a lot of mature organizations don't have at their fingertips, whether it be just project volume and an understanding of the workload that's hitting your learning and development team. And when I was last in an internal organization, I remember having conversations with my CLO about the team is looking stretched, you know, we're really overwhelmed. And he'd always say to me, well, show me how they're stretched. Show me how we're challenged. And that got back to really starting to create a historical set of metrics year over year that could demonstrate those peaks and valleys, that can demonstrate the need or pullback on projects and resources to get things done. So again, I think this data exists in most organizations, but they often struggle to either find it or leverage it as part of their operating of the business. The second piece, learning effectiveness, which is basically the foundation of results. And, you know, for the most part, this is the Kirkpatrick model, level 1, level 2, maybe some level 3, where most mature teams, even younger or less mature learning organizations, do practice some common approach to learning effectiveness. However, as we mentioned earlier, there's often a case where the foundational approach they're using, like for example, how they're designing a survey, can be very inconsistent, maybe to the point Vicki made earlier. And that presents challenges around normalizing the results across functions or across areas. So I think in a lot of cases, although organizations may be doing the right approach with learning effectiveness, there's opportunities to create more consistency in the approach itself. And then finally, organizational impact. And this really gets back to demonstrating the value proposition of learning. As I may have alluded to earlier, I always find that to create success with a higher level of metrics with leadership, you really need to dive into understanding what the business functions and business leadership are looking for. What are their KPIs? What are their objectives? In tying the learning metrics to those larger business objectives. I think a lot of people say it, but the actual ability to do it takes time and effort and a lot of handshaking with the right stakeholders. And I think the other thing here is there's always this mention of ROI, and Stephen and I have some passionate discussions about what you can really demonstrate in that area. And I think other than financial data, there's other things or proof of performance in the organization that we've spent time with, such as speed to knowledge or competency, you know, more billability in the field because we're reducing time out of the field, things of that nature, just cost efficiencies, and even the ability to demonstrate retention of top talent based on investing in their career development and learning. So it's really coming up with the right baseline set of data that's going to tell the right story to your leadership team. But we feel like these three areas, many organizations touch upon. It's just a matter of taking a more formal approach and consistent approach to applying it based on where they are in the process. Stephen, anything you want to add here?
No, that's good, Jim. Well, I'll elaborate on these three in the next set of slides. So the question is, what should you measure? You know, looking at each of those three functional areas. So in operational efficiency, it's running the L&D business. How many basic bread and butter stuff. How many courses have you delivered? How many projects does your learning team produce year over year? Enrollment rates, completion rates, learner populations by function, by job, and so on. What's the cost of delivery? It's the basic core data that any business, whether it's L&D or any other business within the corporation, needs to collect about itself.
Yeah, the one thing I'll add here too, Stephen, that I want to mention is the data for this does not often or always exist in, let's say, the core system like the LMS, right? And that's where you have to really take inventory of the systems you have to produce this kind of data. And in a lot of cases, it doesn't necessarily exist in a formal system. It might be in a spreadsheet or some other format, but that's part of the challenge we'll get to a little later.
Mm-hmm. Learning effectiveness. This is, you know, the real core of what we do. It's the reason we we do learning function within corporations. Level one stuff like how are your courses perceived by the learner? Jim kind of mentioned this. We've had the experience in working with some clients. Everyone does smile sheets level one, Kirkpatrick. The truth is they don't always do them well and properly. And so what questions are you asking? Are you asking the right questions? And then how are you analyzing that data? And is that data consistent across different learning functions within your company? What about assessments? How are you doing assessments? Are the assessments you're creating fair, valid, reliable? What are the differential outcomes? What are the learning gaps? Can you speak about mastery by key learning objectives, not just, yay, pass the test kind of stuff? And then this is a kind of a recent area. Is there an alignment between knowledge and confidence? I'm actually working on a project right now for a client where they noticed that in their sales force, there was a misalignment between what the reps knew and what they thought they knew. And it was really creating some serious problems with their sales function. So we're creating a confidence-based exam to look at that alignment issue and allow them to then act upon areas where there's misalignment. And then organizational impact, the kinds of things that the organization as a whole wants to see. And it's part of our story that we want to tell. Can we show that there's transfer of training? I mean, we're not teaching people just for the sake of teaching them. We're teaching them so they can take what they've learned and apply it to the job. And Jim mentioned some of these measurements, improve time to proficiency, reduce turnover, business impact, alignment with strategic objectives, and return on investment. And there's this notion that you have to come up with a number for ROI, like 142% or something like that. And I kind of look at ROI differently. There's a different way to tell the story of ROI by showing impact in different ways and not coming up with just a single abstract number. We don't really have a lot of time to go into that today, but if anyone wants to talk to me about that, I'd be more than happy to give them examples of better ways of presenting ROI so that they are meaningful to the corporation and make the case for the L&D function. So those are the three pillars that we focus on. And the next question is, of these three pillars, which do you feel you or your clients, let's say, implement most effectively within your organization? If you can display the results, Jeff. Let's sort of split. It's interesting that it's kind of split across the three. That's good. That's interesting because it has to be, ultimately it has to be a balanced approach. You can't just look at one of these three pillars. You have to look at them all together as a totality in order to run L&D and to make the case. First of all, to improve your training ability, your training effectiveness, and also to make the case to the larger corporation.
Steve, do you think the word effectiveness under training effectiveness is the appropriate word? Because I thought you were looking at measures like the number who completed it.
That's operational efficiency.
Oh,
yeah. So course completions is not a metric of training effectiveness, right?
Oh, okay.
That's
right. To Kirkpatrick is what you were saying is the learning effectiveness. Okay, I understand.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's a good question.
So which data do you need? And I think what we're also referring to here is the technologies of the infrastructure that drives the data in your organization. So what we've put together is a very simplistic, what we're calling learning and measurement ecosystem, or basically the stack, what your evolved technology roadmap could look like with a sort of a measurement slant to it. And we'll kind of explain each area in some detail here. So starting with core learning platforms, right? This is kind of the lifeblood of the organization. most organizations, not necessarily all of them, but most will have some sort of learning management component that tracks most of the courseware and activities around training in the organization, right? And in some cases, it could have that sort of survey or exam data, or it may not. But certainly that generally is the core piece. Within that core layer is usually some type of survey tools. We actually worked with an organization that had 3 or 4 survey tools in addition to the LMS, and they were using also the LMS for surveys. So a lot of data coming in from different places, not necessarily in the same format or same data set. And then finally, in some cases, you'll see assessment management systems as a standalone piece of that core infrastructure. Now, more and more, you're seeing less of those. Folks like Stephen know well that many LMS systems or other learning providers will sort of acquire that technology or capability, and it becomes sort of a suite within the LMS. But the idea here is you'll have some sort of baseline capability or technology that collects some of the core data within your learning organization. Then you have what I call sort of specialized learning platforms, right? This would be any combination of learning experience platforms. You have some of the more program-based solutions, and then some of the bigger players like a Degree or an Edcast, where it's really starting to evolve metrics beyond some of the more transactional data and getting more into sort of predictive data around skills, learner interests, trends on what kind of content people are looking for or sharing with their peers. That's an interesting layer that, again, more mature organizations are starting to have, but now have this whole other set of data to start to use.
Yeah, I mean, you know, as you are all aware, there's been a lot of emphasis, even over the last decade or so, on informal learning experiences. And LMSs don't do a real good job of capturing that. And at least part of the value proposition of learning experience platforms is that they do capture those sorts of informal interactions.
That's right. And then as another category, we've identified micro-learning gamification systems, right? In some cases, these are collecting quizzes and assessments and leaderboards and other data points, again, that kind of work disparately from other systems, but is yet another source of information for the learning team to sort of absorb and make decisions about. And then finally, and maybe less thought of in some cases, are other data sources, and those can come from other functional areas of the enterprise. So human capital management, talent management systems, you might be hearing more and more about employee engagement tools coming out of HR or organizational effectiveness teams doing pulse surveys, right? Although the nature of the information they're collecting or measuring there might not be directly aligned to learning, there's usually a connection point to that data set. And it's worthwhile for learning organizations to explore how that can tie into the other data they're using. Other systems, sales enablement tools, you can get engagement data, feedback performance data at a certain level. So ultimately, you can even have other sort of rogue or evolving pilot tools that's getting centralized in a data warehouse as part of your IT or digital knowledge management organization. So the point being is that sources of information and analytics are coming from all different places. At least start to take inventory of what exists in your organization. Doesn't mean you're going to need to look at it all at once, but at least having an understanding of what exists is a good place to then think about what data sets are going to be valuable for you to look at and make decisions around.
Yeah, Jim, if I could just say something here.
Absolutely.
You know, the good news in implementing a measurement strategy is you probably don't need to acquire a lot of software, except for that bottommost layer, the analytics and dashboards. But all of the data sources you need in order to implement a measurement strategy exist. Most companies have one or more of these systems. In fact, Jim and I were just on a call earlier today with a new client. They're a very, very large global corporation. And one of the things they said to us was, you know, whatever comes out of the work you do for us, we can't bring new software into the company. It's really hard, you know, going through their procurement process and everything like that. So we don't want to think about bringing in new software into the company. We were like, fine, we don't need to bring any new software into the company. It all exists already, and that's really the good news.
Yeah, great point, Stephen. And just to add to the analytics piece, I think the point here, based on the maturity of your infrastructure, you could have literally 5 to 10 different interfaces where you can get data. And the point being is that they're not all working together, and it's not brought together in some sort of curated, meaningful way. So even starting to think about what is the conduit that ties that data together, and in leadership discussions I've had, it's recognizing that the data exists, but they don't know where to start in terms of pulling the right pieces together from all the sources they have. So let's kind of kick off a poll on this topic. Which of these systems do you get most of your measurement data from?
Again, multi-response.
Yeah.
Jeff, if you can display the results. Yeah, it's interesting. A lot. LMSs, people obviously, survey systems are incredibly popular. They really are. And I think part of the reason is it's pretty easy to do surveys, actually. You don't need a lot of analytics capability to use SurveyMonkey or something like that. It's interesting that 25% say LXPs, because LXPs are relatively new players. They're new on the scene. So it's interesting to see that. Of course, as Jim said earlier, LMS systems can do a lot of things beyond just launching courses. They can do surveys, they can do microlearning, they can do gamification, depending upon the sophistication of the LMS system itself. So there's overlap here. There's certainly overlap.
Yeah. But I think to your point earlier, Stephen, in most cases, we're not challenged with data. We may have too much in some cases.
Stephen, and Jim, I have a question. Are you going to show in your presentation here a couple of examples of a measurement strategy? Like, you don't have to name the company, but this was their strategy and why they chose that strategy. Here's another strategy, the emphasis on the word strategy, as opposed to what tools or what do you do? I'm thinking more, what does it mean to be strategic or having a measurement strategy? Do you have any to show us?
Well, I'm sorry, go ahead, Jim. You can.
No, I was just going to say, I think our case studies will kind of align how we helped formulate or support a strategy. We're not going to necessarily spell out an exact strategy today, but at least give you some practical examples of how we took some of that more reactive approach to measuring and then applied it to more of a proactive approach.
Mm-hmm. Often, as you'll see the next slide, Mark, the measurement strategy is really embodied within these 3 pillars we identified earlier: organizational impact, learning effectiveness, and operational efficiency. And they're consolidated within a dashboard of some sort. This is an example. It's obviously not a real example, but it does mimic a real dashboard of looking at those measures you need to implement this strategy, and to pull it all together into a single place and to pull it together for on-demand access.
Yeah. I think to that point, Stephen, in this example, which is kind of conceptualizing what an operational efficiency dashboard could look like, the particular data in here is very specific to a particular learning functional need or data that has certain meaning based on the way they operate. And I think the variation from organization to organization can be fairly extreme. I think there's some common ground for sure. And part of what Steve and I do is bring forward sort of, okay, what does a typical taxonomy of metrics look like to start with, right? Sort of a baseline. And then how do you build that from there? But it gets back to my point earlier around what is the business looking to use to make decisions and share insights and show that you're sort of moving the needle in the organization.
I think, Mark, to answer your question, there's no single strategy, obviously, that it's not a one size fits all. But I think our model, our 3-pillar model, will encompass just about any kind of strategy for any corporation. Some companies want to put more emphasis on organizational impact, others more on learning effectiveness, others more on, I just need to run my business day to day. And so those 3 pillars, those 3 domains really encompass all of a measurement strategy.
So good segue into case studies.
Right. Any more questions before we jump into we have 3 case studies we want to show.
Okay. So I think I'll start with this one, Stephen. So this first example was specific to what we would categorize as a very mature but decentralized learning and development function. They had about 6 different learning departments focusing on key areas of the business. And as they were evolving and growing sort of rapidly, although they tried to standardize centrally certain standards and approaches to measurement, it started to take on its own design as you went from function to function. I think it speaks to that inconsistency piece. Beyond the actual design approach for measurement, it was also the fact that the adoption of technology tools was becoming a challenge as well, where they had some redundancy and, again, inconsistency on how they were reporting on results because of the use of different tools and platforms. So what did we do? How did we help? The first thing was really kind of formalize a working group to agree on the principles or the objectives of what needed to be solved first. I think that's another, in a large organization, you're going to have anecdotal and different points of view on what the challenges are and what data is actually going to, again, have meaning for the group. So that helped us really kind of focus in on the key pillars. We talked about 2 of those as the starting point of a foundation. One of the sort of easy wins, if you will, was recognizing that their learner survey approach was completely different from function to function in the learning organization, and standardizing that approach and creating a centralized, consistent dashboard for how that data was going to be shared, whether it be by the CLO or other leadership, was then used and put into practice. So there was some governance behind it, right? It goes beyond just saying, here's the template, run. There has to be a model of accountability to make it happen. We also did a bit on workshops for upskilling, as we kind of talked about earlier. There were gaps in some of the different functions in terms of their knowledge relative to measurement and evaluation theory. So that was certainly well received and kind of standardizing on a common point of view or level of proficiency in how to measure properly. And then we developed business requirements, right? So having an objective sort of point of view on what technologies are going to get them to the future and bring the data in they need was a key to them really making some hard decisions, but also efficient decisions on either consolidating tech or agreeing to adopt a single tech to kind of create that consistent model. Anything there, Stephen, you want to add?
No, that's good. That's good outreach.
Good.
This was a case where, what we talked about before, it's basically a large financial institution. The learning technology infrastructure was just generating huge volumes of data, and they need to know how to analyze and synthesize data in order to tell their success story. And that's, we kept hearing that a lot from the project lead, from the client. I want to be able to tell our story. That was very, very important to her. So we took our value framework, our 3 pillars, and we set about saying, what do you need to communicate in order to run your operation day to day? Can they demonstrate that they're improving their training effectiveness through deploying modern learning? We did workshops for them as well in measurement. And then finally, and I think that the most important part of this project was developing that dashboard that we were talking about that allows them to demonstrate business impact and organizational value. Not necessarily in a pure ROI sense, a number, but telling a story about how L&D impacts the business as a whole.
Yeah. A piece of this too involved customer sentiment in a reach out beyond just the internal learners themselves, but some customer reactions on how well the actual interactions and relationships were happening with that group.
Mm-hmm.
Nope, more here. Sorry, missed that last point.
Yeah, that's the dashboard I was talking about.
Yep, got it.
So this one is kind of, some of what we do is broad-based. We're looking at this big strategy, we're looking at the 3 pillars, we're pulling everything together. Other work we do is more narrowly focused. In this case, I talked about this a bit before. They noticed a misalignment between the portfolio knowledge of their account teams or account managers and their confidence in understanding their product and aligning it to the customer needs. So we created a confidence-based assessment for them that, for people who are not familiar with that, it's a way of measuring knowledge and confidence, and then looking for confidence accuracy. We're not really looking for confidence per se. By and large, account managers, sales representatives, and so on, they tend to be confident people by nature, but often they're overconfident or their confidence is misaligned to what they know, to what they actually know. And so we designed this confidence-based assessment. Think of it as a knowledge check or a learner survey. And we were able to pinpoint areas where there was this misalignment at the regional level, as well as at the learning objective level or the key topic level. And then they were able to work with their sales force to address those areas of misalignment. So we want to just finish with a final thought. If you talk to most learning leaders, people who lead the learning function within corporations, and you say to them, do you have a learning strategy? They'll say, sure, of course I have a learning strategy. And they'll tell you about their onboarding strategies, their continuous learning strategy, the leadership development strategy, their coaching strategy, et cetera, et cetera. And then you say to them, great, do you have a measurement strategy? And at that point, they say, well, we measure, we do surveys, we do some testing, we gather some data about the number of courses we deliver and all that sort of stuff. We try to make ROI arguments, although it's difficult for us to do that. Now, we don't really have a measurement strategy. And our argument is, well, then you can't have a complete learning strategy unless you have a measurement strategy. And that's our value proposition that we bring to companies.
The quote I like to finish with is that the price of light is less than the cost of darkness, right? And the data's out there, use it, right? And from my own experience, not waiting until I need it the most and having a proactive ability to pull it when that time does come up in good and bad situations, data can really drive the business forward even in tough times. So the opportunity is there. It's just a matter of formalizing the approach. And you can, like we said earlier, it's the framework, as Stephen said, it's designed wherever you are on the maturity curve, right? If you're just getting started or you've been doing it for a while and need to kind of pull back and regroup on things, that can be applied, and there are simple steps to kind of create that consistency.
So any final questions, comments? Happy to take them. We have a few minutes.
Steve and Jim, do you find any of your solutions tend to be most commonly used across a number of different scenarios or situations? This seems to be the most robust type of solution.
Mm-hmm.
like whether it's upskilling the knowledge of the people or whatever it might, or establishing a dashboard or whatever.
You want to take that, Jim? Go ahead.
Yeah, I see what you're saying, and I think ultimately, in a couple areas, you know, there's sort of that understanding, at least getting your house in order. And what I like to think of that is spend the time taking inventory of your current state, right? And that applies equally no matter where you are in the journey or the process. Similar to upskilling, you know, I've worked with organizations who have a team of measurement experts, a team of psychometricians. It's rare. But even in those cases, they struggle to keep up with the volume and consistency of a large organization. So the applicability of upskilling, and there's always new knowledge. And I think, again, from our own experience, there's more, I think, understanding of how to design and deliver. But even I think John may have mentioned it's the synthesization of that data, how to interpret it and make business sense of it, that there's always opportunities to upskill and reskill there. So yeah, it's kind of, that's the point. It can fall into all those buckets wherever you are in the path of measurement.
Yeah, and our clients, you know, range all over the place, from relatively narrow cast assignments like developing that confidence-based assessment to full global measurement strategies for large organizations. So it varies all over the place, and it really depends upon what the needs are of the company. And those are obviously the first questions we ask is, you know, what are their needs? What's the story they need to tell? What do they need to know about themselves, and what do they need to tell the rest of the organization about themselves? And, you know, those of you who are on the call who are not part of large corporations, but work either as independent consultants or part of small consulting companies, know it's the reason, and John alluded to this earlier, you know, they're busy day to day doing their jobs. They don't have the time to step back and look at the big picture and really, without that day-to-day pressure, try to understand where they are and where they need to go. And that's why they hire companies like ours or other companies to help them do that. Because not that they can't do it themselves, often they can't do it themselves. They don't have the expertise in the house, but it's often they just don't have the bandwidth to do it themselves.
John, did you have a question or comment?
I do have a question. So I don't remember, Stephen and Jim, if you guys have your own sort of dashboard technology, but to what extent have you been able to have your client companies create that dashboard with something they have in-house?
Mm-hmm.
That's a great question. You want to go first there, Stephen? Or?
Yeah, sure. So this comes back to, we can't bring in any new software, right?
Yeah.
The two tools that we see most often used for creating boards are Tableau, which lots of companies have in-house. If not in the L&D function, they have it somewhere else, maybe in marketing or something like that, business analytics. Or the other tool that we've come across a fair amount, quite a bit recently, is Power BI.
Yeah.
You're familiar, you know, it's a Microsoft tool. It's part of the Office suite, so everyone has it, right?
Yeah.
That's another case where it's a powerful tool. They already have it, and so they don't need to bring it back in now. Bring it in.
Yep.
To add to that, you know, the accessibility of tools like Power BI, Tableau are becoming more and more, I think, prevalent across the business functions beyond where they would traditionally lie. But what I see as often the challenge, John, too, is the resource demand and again, skill set to use it, where the competition for a dashboard, whether it be with HR or sales, and the same resources needed to perform what learning wants, right? So there's a little bit of a shuffle of prioritization, or, you know, you got to kind of make that. I've seen that at least on the learning side where they're kind of the last in line. So
Yeah.
it's a question of, do they bring on their own resources, vendor capability to do it, or can they wait for their internal capability to support it?
Yeah, I've seen that. It's one of those things where the it's part of the Microsoft suite, but it's the licenses to use is limited, and
That's right.
and it's usually like sits in an IT center of excellence, and you do have to get in line, like you said. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
I
Anything
just
else?
wanted to say thank you to you all for, I don't have any specific questions. And I know Jim and Stephen, we've spoken previously. I'm still pushing this whole measurement strategy on my team. And of course, they're running 1,000,000 miles an hour. So, it kind of keeps getting pushed a little bit to the back burner, and I keep bringing it forward because now I'm having other internal folks ask about what are the metrics? How are we going to evaluate this? And, share that across, our organization. So this is very timely once again. And I had hoped to have some others on my team on this call tonight. I don't think that happened, but I would love to take this recording and share it with all of them. And, so that it brings that, again, to the forefront, because we need it. We need it to be, before we start going too far down the path. So thank you very much.
Thanks,
Appreciate it.
Donna. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
I want to echo that. Thank you. This was very informative, and I would like to share it as well, if that's possible.
Sure. That's great. Thanks, Vicki.
Thank you. All right.
Okay.
Those of you who we do post recordings of these events as we do them for our chapter. So the I guess, well, we know who's signed up for this. So one of the things I'll make sure that we do is send you a link to the recording that we put on our YouTube channel.
Great. Thanks, Jeff.
Great. Thanks, Jeff.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
And
Really
thank you for
appreciate it.
another great program. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Mark.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you, guys.
Thank you all for attending. We
Thanks
really
all.
appreciate your
Yep.
time.
Have a great night.
Thanks for
Bye,
coming, everyone.
everybody. Good to see you all.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Stay safe.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.